What's up, guys? Welcome back to another edition of Exposure. I'm laughing at this dude. It's summertime and I'm in the middle of a tin can, which is my front porch with no insulation. So if I start glistening, you'll know why. I'm watching Behizzy's live feed the other night, and Charles S. shows up and says this. Marcus cracks me up. He looks high as a kite most of the time. His videos are really good, though. Charles S. for the win, man. Do I really look high? I wear contacts a lot, so maybe my eyes are irritated. I got deep eye sockets. Maybe it's that. I don't know. I just thought that was hilarious. I can assure you, Charles, it ain't that. Moving on. You guys got your swimsuits ready? Because we're going swimming in the deep end today. I'm talking real deep end, like Mariana Trench deep. I'm talking like the 1980s The Abyss deep, like deep, deep. All right, but before we dive into that pool, just hit that subscribe button and hit that like button for me as well, because it expands the reach of this program. One other point before we get started, I wanted to thank Senator Dush for coming on with us Thursday afternoon and facing some really hard questions about the audit. He came on and faced a firing squad of questions between me and Behizzy, and he answered every one of them. If you haven't seen that interview yet, go check it out on my page. There's so much in there. All right, are you ready? This is about what really transpired on January 6th. Starring Mike Pence. So many of you have probably already seen at this point that Mike Pence's New Hampshire speech was making the rounds at all the news organizations on Friday. He's campaigning in one of the early states, delusionally thinking he has a shot at the presidency. Why not? I'll check it out. I needed a good laugh anyway. So I turned on his speech. I started to watch. It got me thinking about what he did on January 6th. All right, so let's see what he says.
A positive American agenda, a strong military.
Absolutely.
Secure borders. Free enterprise.
Oh, I like that.
Safe neighborhood.
Yep.
Support for law enforcement.
Absolutely.
To fight for the opportunity of every American to choose where their children go to school.
Oh, I can get behind that.
And it will be our party that makes it clear that election integrity is a national imperative, but a state responsibility.
Oh, hold up. Nope. Did he just say that?
And the truth is, after an election that saw several states around the country literally set aside laws enacted by their legislature.
I'm sorry, what? Was that Mike Pence? Like the actual Mike Pence? Like Mike Pence? But weren't you the guy who was...
They want to literally codify many of the very practices that create the greatest opportunity for fraud.
I'm sorry, I got headphones on. Did he just say what I think he... Ooh.
You know, President Trump and I have spoken many times since we left office. And I don't know if we'll ever see eye to eye on that day.
Oh, you don't think you and President Trump will see eye to eye on the issue? Kind of like it's an opinion. Kind of like you just have to agree to disagree, I guess. You know, I think milk chocolate is the best chocolate, and President Trump here, he thinks dark chocolate's the best. I guess we'll just never see eye to eye on what the best chocolate is. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks. Does the Constitution give the Vice President, who is also the President of the Senate, authority to choose electoral slates? Some say no, it can't. Some say yes, it can. These constitutional law professors say it can. Let's look into it. From Just the News on December 8th. Could Pence reject contested electors under 12th Amendment? Law professors say yes. Two law professors are arguing the United States Constitution's 12th Amendment could empower Vice President Mike Pence to reject contested electors and pave the way for the U.S. House to re-elect President Trump under what's known as a contingent election. In an October 19th essay at The American Mind, John Yoo and Robert Delahunty argue that Pence, as presiding officer of the Joint Congressional Sessions on Electors, can refuse to count the electoral votes from disputed states. However, this legal analysis empowering the vice president faces headwinds as states continue to certify results for Joe Biden over President Trump. The scholars argue that while the Electoral Count Act of 1887 appears to create safe harbors for a state's report of its electoral college votes, the act itself might be unconstitutional, because under the 12th Amendment, quote, the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates of the electoral votes of the states, and the votes shall then be counted. You and Delahunty say that unclear is who is to count the electors' votes and how their validity is to be determined. Over the decades, political figures and legal scholars have offered different answers to these constitutional questions. We suggest the Vice President's role is not the merely ministerial one, opening the ballots and then handing them over to be counted. Though the 12th Amendment describes the counting in the passive voice, the language seems to envisage a single continuous process in which the vice president both opens and counts the votes. The check on error or fraud in the count is that the vice president's activities are to be done publicly, quote, in the presence, end quote, of Congress, wrote Yoo and Delahunty. And if counting the electors' votes is the vice president's responsibility, then the inextricably intertwined responsibility for judging the validity of those votes must also be his. If that reading is correct, then the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional. Congress cannot use legislation to dictate how any individual branch of government is to perform its unique duties. Congress could not prescribe how future Senates should conduct an impeachment trial, for example. Similarly, we think the better reading is that Vice President Pence would decide between competing slates of electors chosen by the state legislators and governors, or decide whether to count the votes that remain in litigation. In this scenario, for example, when counting Pennsylvania electors, Pence could choose to count the slate of electors from the Republican legislature in Harrisburg and not the slate of electors from Democratic Governor Tom Wolf. We think so, but it's never happened before. And as we know, there was contested electoral slates given from 6 states. So then the next question is, who has plenary power over selecting electoral slates in each state? Steve Scalise explains that during the House deliberation session following Arizona's objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to object to a number of states that did not follow the constitutional requirement for selecting electors. Madam Speaker, this is something that is clear that our founding fathers debated about as a fundamental decision of how we choose our president. There was a lot of back and forth, if anyone reads the founding documents of our country, about the different versions they went through to ultimately come up with a process where each state has elections, each state has a process for selecting their electors and sending them to Washington. And Madam Speaker, in a number of those states, that constitutional process was not followed. And that's why we're here to object. If you look at what the requirement says, nowhere in Article 2, Section 1 does it give the Secretary of State of a state that ability. Nowhere does it give the governor that ability. Nowhere does it give a court that ability. It exclusively gives that ability to the legislatures. And in fact, in most states, that's the process that was followed. But for those states that this wasn't followed, unfortunately, this is not new. We've seen over and over again more states where the Democrat Party has gone in and selectively gone around this process. That has to end, Madam Speaker. We have to follow the constitutional process. And in fact, over 100 of my colleagues, Madam Speaker, asked the Supreme Court to address this problem just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, the court chose to punt. They didn't answer it one way or the other. They didn't want to get in the middle of this discussion. We don't have that luxury today. We have to discuss this. We have to fix this. But the Constitution is our guide. And it's time we start following the Constitution. It's time we get back to what our founding fathers said is the process for selecting electors. That's the legislatures. In public view, not behind closed doors, not smoke-filled rooms, not bullying somebody that might give you a better ruling. Let's get back to rule of law and follow the Constitution, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
As you guys are just building up a head of steam, Ducey very publicly, with cameras around, signs the certification of the election of November 3rd, 2020. Signs it just to be in your face, to kind of mock you, to kind of mock the patriots that are doing all this work.
As I've said before, we do elections well here in Arizona. The system is strong, and that's why I have bragged on it so much.
As Arizona's leaders put pen to paper certifying our state's election results as accurate,
Arizona leaders signed off on the state's official canvass.
And Mike Pence admits as much right here.
And the truth is, after an election that saw several states around the country literally set aside laws enacted by their legislatures.
So states unconstitutionally certified their electoral college votes, and clearly he knew it happened as evidenced by the clip I just played for you. Didn't that give him the opportunity to select the slate that was certified constitutionally? Were there any other options he was given? What other options did he have?
What Mike Pence could do, and what he should do, in fact, is to direct a question back to the state legislatures when there are two competing slates of delegates from these 6 states. He can ask that question to the states and say, well, state legislatures, I have an oath to the Constitution to uphold the Constitution as written, and Article 2, Section 1.2 says that the state legislatures direct the manner in which electoral delegates are selected. So you tell me which of these 2 slates was selected in the manner that your state General Assembly has designated. And that's a fair question. That's not exercising discretion. That's not setting up any sort of bad precedent. That's actually returning the authority to the constitutionally vested entity. And to simply direct that question, I think, would then require a response from these very timid, to put it lightly, state legislatures that haven't been willing to act. And it would, in fact, then give a very clean outcome to this election. It wouldn't be political. It would just be saying, you're the constitutionally vested authority. You tell me.
So, Jenna, just so I understand, when would he do that in the process? Would he do that as he's going about reading and opening and counting these envelopes, or would that be later in the process after the House and Senate have started to object and debate?
I think constitutionally and procedurally, he'd probably do it at either point. It would make more sense to me, I think, that he would do that before even opening any of the certificates that are sent. And obviously, there are two competing slates. So before he would even open any of those envelopes to say, okay, I'm presented with two separate slates, I need to ask the state legislatures which of these two have been selected in the manner that your state has authorized.
Okay, so he had that option. Why didn't he take it? What was his reasoning? Enter his letter to Congress, which was given to them during the stoppage on January 6th. It reads in part like this. Our founders were deeply skeptical of concentrations of power and created a republic based on separation of powers and checks and balances under the Constitution of the United States. As a student of history who loves the Constitution and reveres its framers, I do not believe the founders of our country intended to invest the vice president with unilateral authority to decide which electoral votes should be counted during the authority. And no vice president in American history has ever asserted such authority. It is my considered judgment that my oath to support and defend the Constitution constrains me from claiming unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. It is my considered judgment. That's what he said. So it was his considered judgment of his oath to the Constitution that constrained him from selecting slates. That's a subjective statement. Having judgment on something is being subjective. What gave him the ability to be subjective? If he has a constitutional right to uphold, why is he being subjective? This is where his advisors come into play. Now, this next part is some great research done by the most unlikely of people. Kyle Cheney, a political reporter, posted this on his Twitter account the next day on January 7th. It's 2:55 a.m., and I just figured out how Pence massaged the rules of the Electoral College counting session to avoid introducing the rival slates of Trump electors. These are the instructions VPs have given out at the start of each of the last 5. Note the difference? Check this out. The verbiage is nearly identical. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of several states. Here's video of Joe Biden in 2017 saying that. Well, at least trying to say that. He could barely speak even back then.
The tellers will dispense with the reading of the formal portions of the certificates. After ascertaining the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors of each state, beginning with the state of Alabama. I read this, he reads this.
But now let's go back to 2021 and notate the added verbiage.
Without objection, the tellers will dispense with the reading of the formal portions of the certificates. After ascertaining that the certificates are regular in form and authentic, the tellers will announce the votes cast by the electors for each state, beginning with Alabama, which the parliamentarians advise me is the only certificate of vote from that state and purports to be a return from the state, and that has annexed to it a certificate from an authority of that state purporting to appoint or ascertain electors.
That the parliamentarians advised me. So what and who was the parliamentarian? The parliamentarian is the Senate's advisor on the interpretation of its rules and procedures. Staff in the parliamentarian's office sit on the Senate dais and advise the presiding officer over the conduct of Senate business. The parliamentarian at the time was this gentleman, Thomas J. Wickham Jr. As a nonpartisan House official for over 25 years, Wickham provided essential guidance to leadership, committees, and members as part of the development and execution of legislative strategy. In leading an office that reviewed every measure that came before the House, he has a command of a broad range of subject matters covering all aspects of government policy. Okay, back to Kyle Cheney's research. That the parliamentarians advised me is the only certificate of vote from that state that purports to be a return from that state that has annexed to it a certificate from an authority of that state purporting to appoint or ascertain electors. Boy, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall during that advisement session? Cheney goes on to explain his findings further. The law specifies that the vice president must introduce all purported electoral votes. This year, that might have included the unserious mock Trump electors. Like I said, he's from Politico. But Pence worked with the parliamentarian to interpret it so only electors backed by a state authority would be introduced. Note how Pence emphasizes before introducing each state that not only is the slate of electors regular and authentic, but that the parliamentarian has advised him is the only one backed by the state authority. That is not a regular acknowledgement at these sessions. And even after all that, 2 U.S. senators gave him another avenue to exact his constitutional authority.
Not ignore the questions that millions of people are asking in our nation. So we have proposed a constitutional solution.
Hey, Mike, did you hear that part? A constitutional solution.
Pause the count. Get more facts to the states before January the 20th. We proposed a 15-member commission, just like what was done after the failed election of 1876. We're encouraging people to spend 10 days going through all the issues so states can have one last opportunity to address any challenges. Then the states, as the Constitution directs, would make the final decision on their electors. I have some colleagues who have said that a 10-day commission is not enough time, so they have counter-proposed, just ignoring the lingering questions. We need to do something.
All of us are faced with 2 choices, both of which are lousy. One choice is vote against the objection. And tens of millions of Americans will see a vote against the objection as a statement that voter fraud doesn't matter, isn't real, and shouldn't be taken seriously. And a great many of us don't believe that. On the other hand, most, if not all of us, believe we should not set aside the results of an election just because our candidate may not have prevailed. And so I endeavored to look for door number 3, a third option, and for that I looked to history, to the precedent of the 1876 election, the Hayes-Tilden election, where this Congress appointed an electoral commission to examine claims of voter fraud. 5 House members, 5 senators, 5 Supreme Court justices examined the evidence and rendered a judgment. And what I would urge of this body is that we do the same. That we appoint an electoral commission to conduct a 10-day emergency audit, consider the evidence, and resolve the claims. For those on the Democratic aisle who say there is no evidence, they've been rejected, then you should rest in comfort. If that's the case, an electoral commission would reject those claims. But for those who respect the voters, simply telling the voters, go jump in a lake, the fact that you have deep concerns is of no moment to us. That jeopardizes, I believe, the legitimacy of this and subsequent elections. The Constitution gives to Congress the responsibility this day to count the votes. The framers knew what they were doing when they gave responsibilities to Congress. We have a responsibility. And I would urge that we follow the precedent of 1877. The Electoral Count Act explicitly allows objections such as this one for votes that were not regularly given. And let me be clear, this objection is for the state of Arizona, but it is broader than that. It is an objection for all 6 of the contested states to have a credible, objective, impartial body hear the evidence and make a conclusive determination. That would benefit both sides. That would improve legitimacy of this election. And so let me urge my colleagues, all of us take our responsibility seriously. I would urge my colleagues, don't take perhaps the easy path, but instead act together, astonish the viewers, and act in a bipartisan sense to say we will have a credible and fair tribunal, consider the claims, consider the facts, consider the evidence, and make a conclusive determination whether and to what extent this election complied with the Constitution and with federal law.
And yet, at the end of the day, he still does this.
Madam Speaker, the Vice President and the United States Senate.
The tellers will ascertain and deliver the result to the President of the Senate.
The report we make is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be the President and the Vice President according to the ballots that have been given to us.
The whole number of electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the Senate and the House of Representatives. The purpose of the joint session having concluded, pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, 117th Congress, the chair declares the joint session dissolved.
Hey, Mike, I want you to hear something. I don't know why you did what you did. I don't know what kind of advice you received to do what you did. And I don't know what the motivating factors were for you to do what you did. The American people may not be able to verbalize their frustrations like I just did, but they can feel it. And they know what you did was wrong. And you know what you did was wrong. You defended him, well, at least when the cameras were on you, when seemingly everybody else had deserted him. And still, when you had plenary power to make the decision with the full weight of constitutional authority behind you, you ran. Hear me loud and clear, Mike. You will never be president. And the fact that you think you can go to one of the first primary states in New Hampshire who's fighting for election integrity from the last election right now is utterly shameless. You are out of touch and you have no clue where the heads of real Americans are at. And that is the real story of January 6th. Subscribe, like, share, see ya.